All right, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending where you're joining us. My name is Lisa Osipenko. I'm the CEO of Consilium Scientific, and today we're welcoming Dr. Aaron Mitchell from Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital in New York. And Aaron is a practicing oncologist, but he's also interested in policy work and is doing a lot of policy work, looking into the conflict of interest in oncology. So, Aaron, please go ahead. The floor is yours. When you're ready.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I've got my feet in a lot of different worlds. The clinical oncology world, specifically prostate cancer, which is where I focus clinically, drug pricing, drug policy, care delivery more generally. But I do have one branch of my research which is very much centrally focused on conflict of interest, specifically financial conflict of interest between physicians and the drug industry. So I'd like to share some of that work today, and just kind of give an overview of this whole topic and share both some of my work and some from others that really supports at least the concern I have about the influence of financial conflict of interest on oncology practice. All right, so first of all, my disclosures relevant to the topic today. I don't really have any financial disclosures. My main disclosure is with respect to probably what is my favorite tweet of all time. I am, in fact, a holder of an MD, MPH degree, which, as pointed out here, is the most worthless degree in existence. So everyone hang on tight as I get ready to throw some dangerously bad science your way. All right, so industry payments to physicians, industry conflict of interest, financial conflict of interest, these different terms that I will probably be using interchangeably through this talk without thinking about it. What I mean when I use those terms is I'm thinking of the kinds of discrete financial transactions that occur between drug and device manufacturers and U.S. physicians, such that are reportable or required to be reported under our open payments reporting system, to the tune of $5 billion in financial value per year getting transferred to U.S. physicians and teaching hospitals. Industry has to report all such transactions that they make, and then our government then cleans and aggregates these data and makes them available for free public download and public search on their website. We're using this source of data as the underlying data set in most of the work I'll be presenting, but just kind of to lay the groundwork in terms of the distribution of this dollar value. So it's roughly evenly split between payments going to physicians and payments going to teaching hospitals. And then our government website, again, this is called Open Payments, also referred to historically as the Sunshine Act. It splits these payments into a couple of different categories. One is research payments. That's anything related to a specific research protocol, whether that's preclinical or clinical research. You can see payments to physicians there's not so much there in terms of research payments. On the hospital side, there is more research funding going towards hospitals. But what I'm really going to be talking about today are the non-research payments, also called general payments, and specifically for the most part, general payments going towards to individual physicians. So what are these general payments? So this is really everything else that's not research related. And this is really the kinds of things that we think of when we talk about or conceptualize, at least I do, industry payments to U.S. physicians. So it includes both cash payments, such as for physicians doing speaking engagements or physicians doing consulting. It also includes in-kind items such as free meals, free travel, etc. Some things that I often get asked about that this does not include research funding. As I said, that's a separate bucket within this system. So anything research related would not be included here as a general payment. It doesn't include drug samples because those are eventually a transfer of value not to the physician, but to the patient. And then anything meeting the technical legal definition of a kickback. Right, physicians can't get paid specifically for writing a prescription. That would be illegal, but it is somehow legal for industry to pay physicians and for them later to use, I guess, some kind of wall or barrier in between them, subsequently prescribe that same company's products, as long as it's not a direct correlation between the two. So by the numbers, if you just count the number of payments that happen each year far and away the most common type of payment is a free meal. So a drug typically, what this is a drug industry representative showing up at a physician's office for lunch or maybe an after-hour dinner event. And the physician is then receiving both the free food as well as information from the drug manufacturer about their products, about prescribing information, getting kind of like the elevator pitch or a longer elevator pitch on what these on what that company's products are and what their offerings are. So that's by the number of payments. When you look by dollar value, it looks a little bit different. This long one here that gets cut off is basically speaking fees. So that's speaking, then consulting, food and beverage, travel and lodging. These are the big dollar value categories. And then on any given year, it's like 85 to 90% are taken up by these four categories. The things I showed on the previous slide, you can kind of keep in mind as the main types of payments to physicians. There are some other categories here, but they are really much rarer and convey much less dollar value overall. So it's mostly those things I showed on the other slide. So what does the distribution of industry payments look like? And specifically, what does it look like within oncology? That's the field and the area that I know best. So there's a lot of them. There's a lot to specifically within hematology oncology. We've got a little bit of competition from endocrinologists and rheumatologists, but we are one of the highest receiving medical specialties in terms of the average per physician amount of money that we receive from the drug and device industry. And the amount that we receive has been increasing. So oncologists are the green line there in the middle. The blue line represents general internists who are more a generalist specialty, who don't have specific subspecialty training, just there as a qualitative reference. So oncologists both make a lot more from industry each year, and the amount that we make has been increasing out of proportion to more generalist specialties who don't specialists who don't prescribe a lot of expensive drugs. And then that red line up top is when I'll delve into a little bit further. So this is the particular growth in payments that has occurred between academic oncologists or influential oncologists in recent years. So in this chart that we published a couple years ago in the Oncologist Journal, all oncologists writ large across the US, all 13,000 of us are in the black line at the bottom. So that's give or take $5,000 a year. Recent years, more like $6,000 or $7,000 a year that we're getting from industry, an amount that has been creeping up. But if you're at one of the major cancer centers, we define that in our project as being one of the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, or NCCN institutions. That's about 1,800 of us oncologists, and there you're in the green line. So if you're at an NCCN institution, on average, you're getting a lot more money from industry each year, upwards of $10,000. And then if you are at an NCCN institution, and you are one of the selected physicians to serve on the NCCN's guideline panel, which is a worldwide set of clinical practice guidelines for oncology that really sets the standard of care for what all oncologists everywhere do. If you're on one of those guideline panels, then you're really up at the top. You're either in this yellow line, let's call this like the prevalent for prevalent guideline authors, and then the blue line is the new guideline authors who were newly invited to one of these panels during our study period. So you see these influential oncologists, these key opinion leaders are really at the top. Some other researchers have looked at this as well. So I'm kind of looking at group averages, but then when you look at the distribution within academic oncologists, as this study did, you'll see this kind of the very skewed distribution where you've got a lot of oncologists receiving smaller amounts of money, although really this is our y-axis here is a percentage of salary. So when you think about how much physicians in the United States make, even these doctors here in kind of the middle are making, many thousands to tens of thousands of dollars per year. And then you've got this small peak that on this chart that kind of resembles the income distribution within the United States more broadly, where you've got doctors receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars per year in this selected group of your highly influential key opinion leaders. So then previously I showed, again, this is looking again at the NCCN authors, which I showed previously in terms of an overall group average, but this chart here is just to give you a better sense of just what the distribution is. So the group average was somewhere in there like $5,000 to $10,000, and it breaks down as a pretty even distribution. About half of these guideline writing oncologists are receiving in excess of $1,000 per year. And then you've got about a quarter who are receiving $10,000 a year or more, and even a small percentage who are receiving payments in excess of $50,000 a year, which is an interesting threshold that we're looking at in some current work that I'll allude to, because the $50,000 a year threshold is actually supposedly the self-imposed limit, dollar value limits by the NCCN. And in theory, they tell their guideline authors not to exceed that. And if they do exceed that amount, then they're asked to step down from their position. So we have a few people who are in violation of the NCCN's self-imposed conflict of interest limits. That's what the distribution looks like. Industry payments are higher among oncologists than other specialties. The amount that we oncologists receive has been increasing, and it's really and especially high among the influential oncologists, the key opinion leaders, such as those who stand on guideline writing committees. So how does this influence us? So we've known for quite some time that receiving money and gifts from the drug industry influences physicians. This is one of my favorite papers going back now several decades to look at this issue. And the authors of this study looked at a single drug and a single hospital's use of that single drug over time with respect to a couple of different time events on this chart. The first is when this drug, they don't name it, it was a cardiovascular drug that came out in the early 90s. I'm not sure what that would be. That's like Plavix, maybe, something like that. And they look at the prescribing of this drug over time. After getting added to the formulary, kind of bounces around, stays relatively low for a while. And then the company comes to this hospital, invites all the physicians there to this symposium, at which physicians will receive a few hours per day of information about this drug from the company, but then have most of their day to rest and relax and enjoy an all expenses paid vacation. And then pretty soon after this event, after the invitation to this event comes out, and then after the event happens, there's a pretty clear trend over time in the utilization of this drug. This is just one case, though. Anecdotes not being data. We've done some work similar, looking at different cancer drugs. So suffice it to say that we've got sets of cancer drugs here that all of which would be appropriate therapeutic choices for their respective cancers. And what we're asking here is, within a set of therapeutically equivalent and acceptable drugs, do oncologists get nudged one way or the other by receiving payments from the manufacturer of one of those drugs? So, for example, if the physician, in this case of this drug here, sunitinib, if a physician had not received money from the manufacturer of sunitinib, that's the darkly shaded bar, and it's making up about 1/3 of their overall prescriptions for this cancer type, kidney cancer. And then if they had received money from the manufacturer of sunitinib, then sunitinib is making up about half of their prescriptions for kidney cancer on average. So we see a significant trend consistently of an increase. The one case of a decrease here is actually the drug Gleevec. We were looking at the time period immediately before Gleevec went off patent and became available as generic imatinib. So what we think is happening here is so imatinib and nilotinib, the drug furthest on the right, are actually both made by Novartis. So we think Novartis was actually doing kind of a product hopping strategy, where they were convincing physicians to stop using their older drug that was going off patent and switch to their newer drug, nilotinib. So that's the reason for this one decrease here, we hypothesize. So work that I've done, like what I just showed, is largely correlational. We kind of look at payments in one year and then prescribing the next year in order to preserve that temporal association and the temporality of our exposure and outcome. But it's fundamentally a cross-sectional type of study. But there are other authors who've applied more rigorous causal inference types of methods to look at a similar question, and in my view, allow us to conclude pretty strongly that there is likely a causal impact here. In other words, it's not just correlation between which doctors receive payments and which doctors prescribe more of a company's drug, it is the case that doctors prescribe more of a company's drug because they receive payments. At least that's my conclusion, based on this study here by Colleen Carey and et al. And what this study did is it's looking basically across time, looking at all different drugs, all different drug classes that they can measure in Medicare claims. And it's called an event study analysis, where physicians here are basically serving as their own prior controls. And so you'll see in individual physicians, and this is, of course, aggregated across all physicians and all drugs, but you'll see as prior to the receipt of a payment in month 0, prescription of a company's drug is pretty stable going backwards in time. And then when they receive money from a given company in month 0, the prescriptions for that company's drug then go up in the future going forward. So since doctors are controlled for here in the sense that they're serving as their own prior controls, and we're looking at departure from their own prior prescribing behavior, this really enables us to kind of zero out any physician level confounding, which could be present in other studies like mine, to be honest, like the one I just showed. So they're able to really tease out anything that is a correlational part of the overall association. And when that's taken away, we see we see pretty clear causal impact as well. So we know that these payments influence us to some degree. And we reviewed all studies looking at this question that we could find, all studies trying to measure an association between receipt of a given company's, receipt of payments from a given company and prescribing of that same company's drugs. We found 36 studies. Every single one of those 36 studies found a positive and statistically significant association between payments and prescribing in one or more of their primary analyses. We conclude that based on the highly consistent evidence across all different medical specialties, all different drug classes, as well as several studies, such as the one I just showed, demonstrating a pretty clear causal claim, that it seems like that there's a pretty clear association, a pretty clear causal association, and a pretty clear conclusion that we can draw that industry payments influence physicians and do so consistently. So that's really the first part of the question, which is, can these payments influence us? Can they sway our prescribing? In a case like, or in a study like the one of ours that I showed a minute ago, we actually set that study up as a proof of principle or a test case in which we specifically chose drugs that are interchangeable, valid therapeutic substitutes, in which you could look at and say, well, no patient is getting harmed or could be getting harmed because all of these different options are approved and guideline concordant for the respective cancer type. We kind of chose that as our starting point because we're seeing like, well, if industry payments could influence doctors anywhere, it's probably going to be the cases where drugs are interchangeable that we would see this effect. So let's start there. Clearly, the answer is yes. Now we're trying to extend that question to really look at areas where there's a greater potential for concern, a greater potential for patient harm. So there's been some work in this area. I've liked this study. This is kind of a high-level study done a few years ago by Greenway and Ross in the BMJ. And what this study looked at is just kind of the high-level distribution of industry payments and physician prescribing across different drugs with respect to how good these drugs are, how much are they helping patients. They use for their reference there in terms of how good drugs are as the Prescriere group. Sorry if I'm butchering that. I know this is a European group, and I was actually not sure which language that is originally from, but that is so I'm pronouncing it Prescriere. But rates newly approved drugs in terms of how much therapeutic benefit they are bringing to the market. And what these authors observe is that when you look at, first on the right side, the top prescribed drugs by physicians, the drugs that are, the vast majority of them are rated by Prescriere as offering an advantage, or at least possibly offering an advantage over drugs that were already on the market. So that's 76% of these. However, when you look at the drugs that are the top promoted drugs by industry, it was only 19% of their sample of drugs that had a high or possible therapeutic benefit. I think I support or in agreement with these authors' conclusions that maybe like doctors are kind of naturally drawn towards drugs that have a big medical benefit and impact. And then it's those drugs that that doctors aren't going to naturally be prescribing anyway, that industry then has to spend a lot of money to promote and try and convince us to prescribe. There's also some evidence, I would say circumstantial evidence of harm when you look at some specific, most egregious cases of industry promotion and utilization. So this is a study that looked at this particular drug called repository corticotropin under the brand name Acthar gel, which was a rebranded version of a generic drug that, because of its age, is never really been proven to be effective in the kind of phase 3 or FDA or EMA required testing that a newly created drug would need to undergo. And so it's this older drug that's kind of been grandfathered in and then rebranded to be very expensive without much clinical evidence of benefit or absence of clinical evidence. You see that it's now grown, at least as of when this was when the study was published in the late 20-teens, of costing Medicare in excess of $500 million a year, which is really quite staggering. When you looked, and this study reports on that the doctors prescribing or the prescribing of this drug was highly concentrated in a very small number of physicians who were able to drive this huge amount of utilization and expense. And the vast majority of prescribing physicians had all received high amounts of payments from the drug manufacturer. So it seemed like a case where there was a very low value drug and the utilization was very much being driven by industry promotion. Here's another case where these authors looked at a set of what I would just call like useless drugs. So for example, we have these rebranded combinations of long-term generic drugs like ibuprofen and famotidine. They take these two molecules, put them together in one pill, and then jack up the price, 10, 20, 100-fold. It is the odds of a physician prescribing these drugs for having received, with the exposure of having received money from the drugs manufacturer is pretty high, pretty striking. So it's pretty clear that these are, like I said, they're fairly useless drugs, and the utilization is being driven very much by industry promotion of them. There's also some what I would call potential harms or potential concerns related to financial conflict of industry outside of just the prescribing practices. And I think it gets into the whole prevalent philosophy or prevalent view of physician industry interaction that I think is common among medical practitioners and among my colleagues on the medical side. There's a couple of arguments, let's call them arguments, or a couple of ideas out there that I think are pretty prevalent, which is one, that industry payments to physicians are needed because they help to further innovation, that there's scientific benefit from physicians working with industry, and it's therefore necessary for physicians to be able to receive consulting fees, speaking fees, to have their travel compensated, et cetera, in order to work with industry in this way. And the second argument out there is that industry payments to physicians, and this is now more like your free meals type of payments, that it's helpful for physician education. And this was a study or more of a think piece a few years ago that really put forward this idea that this is a good source of useful information for physicians. And I think this philosophy or this idea was pretty well encapsulated in the following quote from the second study there, which is that the goals of physicians and industry are remarkably congruent and complementary. Both want effective medications and devices that benefit patients. Doctors want to learn new treatment modalities, and industry wants to educate doctors in those techniques and products. So just to kind of give the general view that it's certainly not the unanimous view, but I'd say is a fairly prevalent one among physicians. So with this background, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of our recent work extending what we know about the potential harmful impact of industry payments on patient care. I highlighted a few studies that by Greenway and Ross, et cetera, that on the high level have correlated industry promotion with less valuable and less good drugs, and some looking at specific instances that seem to suggest that doctors are more apt or more likely to prescribe low value drugs when they've received industry payments. We're extending on this prior work by now, trying to get into patient-level data and see our individual patients, specifically cancer patients, are they more likely to receive either non-recommended or low-value cancer care practices from doctors who've received industry payments. We're going to look at 4 specific forms of care. I'm going to use the words non-recommended, but really this is a combination of 2 things. There's non-recommended forms of care. That would be the first 2, bone-modifying agents for castration-sensitive prostate cancer and growth factors for patients who are receiving chemotherapy with a low risk for febrile neutropenia. So what do these things mean? The first is a group of drugs that strengthens bones and prevents cancer-related bone fractures. They're useful for a lot of patients, but not this specific group of patients. And so we have guidelines telling us actively not to use these drugs for prostate cancer patients with castration-sensitive disease. Similarly, the second exposure or the second outcome here, growth factors, are immune system boosters, which you use in order to reconstitute the immune system after a patient receives chemotherapy so that they don't get life-threatening infections. Very useful for some for some groups of patients, but for patients who are at a low risk for these infectious events anyway, it's not recommended to use these growth factors. The patients don't need them. So you have the NCCN, again, our reference standard for cancer care, as well as the American Society of Clinical Oncology, or ASCO, putting out guidelines telling us not to do these things unnecessarily. So the first 2 things here then are non-recommended services. They're active guideline recommendations telling us not to do it. The second 2, use of this brand name drug called nab-paclitaxel, or brand name Abraxane, over a much older and cheaper therapeutically equivalent form called paclitaxel. It's not non-recommended. Like, we don't expect excessive side effects or excessive or potential patient toxicity from the use of these agents. It's more a case of they're therapeutically equivalent, and we're just using an agent that is much more expensive to achieve the same benefit. So it's really more of a low value case. So that's Abraxane. And then same thing for the bottom one, using or continuing to use a brand name cancer drug when there is a generic or biosimilar version that would be an appropriate alternative. So these are our 4 services that we're going to be evaluating with respect to whether the doctor using them had received industry payments. So our study approach is what I'll call 4 studies in 1. So we're really doing 4 studies, 1 for each of these different non-recommended services, all at the same time, just all together. So we've got a set of all Medicare patients in the United States who had cancer during the years 2014 to 2019. And then we're going to go in and define a separate group of patients for each of these non-recommended services. It's basically the set of patients with the relevant cancer types. So we looked at, and we included patients who had a new cancer diagnosis after a washout period. So we require that patients are observed in the data for at least a year, no cancer diagnosis for that full year period, and then we see a new cancer diagnosis occurring at some point thereafter, allowing us to make the inference they have a new cancer diagnosis. And then we look around that time point. So when the new cancer diagnosis occurred, and we look at the set of physicians who had a specialty of medical oncology, and we find the medical oncologist who had the greatest number of office visits for each patient in proximity to that patient's diagnosis date. And we then say, okay, this is the managing oncologist for that patient. We then define the exposure and outcome for each of these groups. This is a lot, but just to try and walk through it in simplified terms, the exposure for each of these groups basically comes down to, did each patient's oncologist recently receive money from the manufacturer of the low value or non-recommended service? All right, so in our first one here, we're looking at bone modifying agents, bone strengthening agents for prostate cancer. Specifically, we're looking at the one agent that is still on patent or on brand. That's denosumab, also known as Xgeva. This is the brand name. So our exposure is, did that patient's doctor recently receive promotional payments from Amgen related to Xgeva, this drug? And then our outcome is, did the patient then receive denosumab inappropriately within the first 180 days after their diagnosis? When patients over time go from castration sensitive to castration resistant, those are the patients that need the drug, but we take care of that problem just by looking at the first 180 days when everyone is still castration sensitive. So we know that in this patient cohort at this time, this would be overuse of denosumab. So we see our patients more likely to get overuse of denosumab if their physician had recently received payments. Similar for each of these other exposures. Did the patient's physician get money from the manufacturer? And then the outcome is, did the patient get the non-recommended service of interest? We took two different statistical modeling approaches. The first is to assess the association between our set of outcomes and our set of exposures using a fairly conventional general linear model that adjusts for some readily available confounders, likely confounders, such as the year of treatment or the year of diagnosis, to be specifically correct there, the patient age, patient comorbidity, et cetera. And then we have a second model in which we also introduce what's called physician-level fixed effects. So what this is each physician who's in our data set becomes their own term in the model. So fixed effect then allows us to quote unquote control for each individual oncologist. This is me not being a biostatistician. The way I then conceptualize what this fixed effects or what these fixed effects then allow us to do is basically average out a physician's overall prescribing behavior across the whole study period. So of course, some physicians, just because there's natural person-to-person variation, are going to be prescribing these non-recommended services at a slightly higher rate than other physicians. So for each physician, we kind of, this fixed effect allows us to set that physician's overall baseline and then allow us to assess for departures from it. What this means then is that this model would only give us a positive estimate if it is the case that physicians are differentially likely to use non-recommended services when they have recently received a payment from that drug's manufacturer compared to times when they have not. So this is our unadjusted exposure and outcome distribution. Each of these sets of bars are each of our 4 different cohorts. So CSPC, this is castration-sensitive prostate cancer. That's did they receive non-recommended denosumab, the bone strengthening drug. GCSF, that's granulocyte colony stimulating factors. This is did they receive non-recommended growth factors when they did not need them based on having chemotherapy that was low risk for suppressing their immune system. Did they receive low-value Abraxane, this higher-cost drug, over generic and much cheaper paclitaxel? And then the last one is actually inverse now. So we see this kind of unexpected reverse association between the likelihood the physician used a generic or biosimilar version or the continued to use the branded version. This is unadjusted. Now we adjust for our confounders in our 2 different statistical models. Here, this is the outcome is reported in terms of a prevalence difference. So this is in terms of a percent, but it's on an absolute scale. So for example, here, let's just take this one here, the 17.5% for castration-sensitive prostate cancer. So what this would mean is if 20% of patients whose doctors had not received payments received this non-recommended service, then it would be 37.5% of patients whose doctors had received payments who received the unnecessary service. So it's like, just to make it clear, this is on the absolute scale. So if it was that, it would be more like, it would actually be like a doubling of the rate of inappropriate prescribing. So it's not just like a 17% relative increase, absolute increase. Anyway, so that is what we found on the when we adjusted for the patient characteristics alone, the age, the comorbidities, et cetera. And then when we introduce physician-level fixed effects, obviously there's a lot of physician-level confounding that this is controlling for, and our estimates go towards the null. But what we see here is that at the end of the day, we're left with a couple of estimates that look null and a couple of estimates that remain pretty strongly and statistically significantly positive. So it looks like patients are more likely to receive non-recommended denosumab and more likely to receive low-value Abraxane in cases where there's no need, when their doctors have received payments. So in summary, industry gifts and money influence prescribing. And we're now seeing, with our recent study, increasing evidence that industry gifts and money may be capable of inducing harmful prescribing. So I know that I'll get asked, so what are the next steps? How do we fix this problem? I don't have all the answers, but a few specific ones that I've thought about. So one would be, can we increase our regulation and enforcement? What are different things that stakeholders and actors could do right now? So on the regulatory side, if I was a payer, whether I was a private payer or a government payer such as Medicare, you could think more about where we're applying our networks, who we're including in our networks, and when we are applying utilization management tools such as prior authorization and step therapy. All this information that we're getting from the Open Payments database is all publicly available. So it would be fairly straightforward for a payer to look and see which companies doctors in their networks have been getting money from, and then maybe add some additional layers of approval for a doctor to prescribe drugs manufactured by companies for which they have a strong relationship. On the federal and regulatory side, and this is what we've written in the study or a piece a couple of years ago in a law journal, is that if you go by the current interpretation of by the DHHS Office of Inspector General, a lot of these payments currently meet the existing definition of potentially being in violation of the anti-kickback statute. So there is a legal argument to be made that greater enforcement, meaning penalties for the types of relationships, physician-industry relationships that are already very common, greater enforcement could be taken under existing law. So if the government decided that it's spending unnecessarily too much money on unnecessary Abraxane, then it could start taking greater action to enforce and discourage the types of payments that are leading to overuse of these low-value, non-recommended drugs. The second type of solution is, to some degree, there's a little bit of public shaming could go a long way. So I previously talked about the NCCN guidelines, and I previously showed a paper that we published in 2016 that kind of shone some light on how common conflicts of interest were among these guideline authors and the drug industry. So we followed up on the study a few years later, and what we look at here are two groups of NCCN authors. On the right, we have NCCN authors who maybe they have some conflict of interest, but they never have violated the NCCN's own self-imposed limit of $50,000 per year. And we see among these guideline writing physicians, what's the churn, right? So how many of them turn over, how many of these seats turn over on a given year? And it looks like it's maybe on the midway here, it's like 85% or so. And that's been pretty constant over these past several years. Then we look at this other group over here on the left, which is the doctors who are on this guideline panel, and they did receive industry payments in excess of the $50,000 per year. What is the likelihood that they retain their seat for at least an additional year? So that's the question we're asking here, and this is what the percentage is. So then you look at this kind of point right here. This is when our study came out and said, hey, here's all these doctors on this guideline committee getting all this money. Here's the percentage of them that are getting in excess of $50,000 per year. And then you'll see what it looks like, a kind of a stepwise change in the likelihood that these doctors retain their seats on a guideline committee going forward. So we're inferring there some degree of increased enforcement by the NCCN of its own guideline or its own conflict of interest policy in response to both availability of open payments data to keep track of these things, but then also with respect to the publication of our study. And then where we're taking things going forward. So we're going to continue to build the evidence base about industry payments to inform future policy change. So we've studied in our study that I just showed today, 4 specific things, 4 specific non-recommended and low-value services. That's obviously a pretty small slice of all cancer care. So we're in the process of broadening our study and our work to look at all treatments in cancer writ large. And can we assess on really the oncology care delivery system level whether industry payments are good or bad, right? There's an argument to be made that they could be facilitating the faster uptake and dissemination of new treatments if doctors are hearing about these new treatments at drug dinners, let's say. So we're going to look at both sides of that coin and see what the overall impact is. We're also going to look at the impact on aggressiveness of end-of-life care, as well as the impact on cost of care. Are physicians tending to get swayed more towards higher cost drugs than cheaper ones? And like to thank our funders and being able to continue to pursue this work. And with that, I think I'm right at about the 40-minute mark. We've got some time to discuss. Happy to take as many questions as there are, and I'm happy to stay on longer to stick around past the hour if there are. So with that, I'm done and happy to hear what everyone thinks. Oh, and I see some stuff in the chat. I hope these were not like, you can't hear me.
No, it's all good.
Oh, it's
So
how to
thank
pronounce
you so much,
prescrire. Okay.
Erin. Yes, we'll send you
Prescrire.
something
Okay.
on this prayer. Could you please close your slides so we can see
Sure.
everyone on the screen?
Oh, all right.
So please do turn on your cameras and raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. If you're unable to speak, you can put your question in the chat and I'll read it. So go ahead and while we're waiting for raised arms. So Erin, I do have a question for you. So in the UK, they're trying to create a database, a similar database. And I'm just wondering, I mean, it's good to have, of course, it's better to have than not to have, but was there any change in the US after the Sunshine Act was introduced and the database was produced? And did anyone do the before after analysis and what were the results? And are patients even aware? Because you interact with patients. Have you ever come across a patient who said, I went on the database, Dr. Mitchell, and I looked you up and wow, why don't you take any money from anyone? Like, how does this work? Do patients even engage with that or it's not even for them?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second question first. I've never encountered a patient who was aware of the database. I think it has maybe a little bit of physician curiosity and then mainly researchers like myself who use it and probably journalists as well, I'm sure. But as far as patients, I'm really not aware. I'm sure it's greater than zero, but it is not something that has ever come up in my practice. And then, well, now to forget your first question. What was the first part of it? Just to trigger
The
my
first question, did the introduction of the database and making this information public make
yes.
any difference?
Yeah. So that's yes. So I think the answer is yes. It's a tricky study to do because most of the data that we have on industry payments is all from open payments itself. And that's only kind of the post-intervention period. So in order to make a comparison before and after, you need some other data set. So other researchers, not myself, have gone back to a couple of different ways. In some cases, there were industry entities that were mandated to disclose all of their payments in response to legal action because they basically got caught red-handed doing something really bad and then had to disclose that. So you can kind of look at then a before and after for specific companies. And then there were a few US states that previously had disclosure laws before we had a national law. So you can look within those states and see before and after, was there a change? And it looks like, yes, it looks like I've seen a few studies that have looked at both the payments themselves and then the prescribing. And it does seem like there's a small but detectable impact on both the amount of money that doctors receive, a reduction, and a reduction in the prescribing of like low value drugs. I think particularly one study looked at statins. So did you shift then from the higher cost statins towards the lower cost generic statins when you knew that this new spotlight or transparency was coming? And it looks like the answer is yes. So small changes, but changes nonetheless.
All right, so there's a link from Adrian in the chat about the article where they started that there was no difference in conflict of interest, but you answered a slightly different question. So, okay, we have two questions. One is from Dr. Bennett. Please go ahead.
Hi, great talk. I want to say I really, I like to talk the data. One solution maybe, if you're trying to talk about sanctioning and other things, and you asked whether patients are ever aware. Alicia Mundy had a front page article in the Wall Street Journal, where she identified physicians that were maybe over $1 million prescribing of Lucentis versus Avastin in the eye. And my mother read that Wall Street Journal article, and she copied it and clicked it, and she brought it to our physician, who happened to be number one on the list. And then she asked him why he was number one. And so the question about here it is if you could actually get Alicia Monday or somebody to write up the list and put the 5 guys' names at the top of the list in the Wall Street Journal, and we did some public shaming of the top 5 guys, I think a lot of the guys in the lower part of the list would not want to be in the upper part of the list, and they start dropping out. So I think if we could get the Wall Street Journal to pick our 5 most hated physicians of the month in the article, we could probably affect a lot of physicians.
Okay, that's one strategy. So probably won't impact their personal wealth since they already done what they to ensure that they're fine. Okay, so James, your question. Unless Aram, would you like to comment?
Yeah, it sounds like a good extension of the public shaming proposal that I already said. So yeah.
Yeah, and actually there are effective results of this campaign, because Transparimed, that works with Consilium Scientific, works for making results of clinical trials publicly available, and they use public shaming strategy very effectively on Twitter, literally going one university after another or one hospital after another, asking where the results of the published trials, and that worked very well. It's not 100% success rate, but it works. So probably not the route we wish we would take, but humans are humans. So it's one of the techniques that seems to be successful. So James, please go ahead with your question. I think we lost James for the moment. He just re-entered the room.
Oh,
James, if you can hear us.
Yep.
If you can
Sorry,
hear
I dropped out there trying to sort out my camera. Thanks for an excellent talk. Thanks for excellent talk, Aaron. I wanted to know if you'd had any progress with any of your solutions. You know, if anyone was, if any of those authorities or institutions were responsive to them.
I mean, no, so far, right? But I think that is still, on my part, still for lack of trying. I think I'm still, as I see it, in the process of building an evidence base on which to continue to make further claims about the need for regulation, and then hopefully once I'm a little bit further in that and can speak from more expertise and from more with more definitive and incontrovertible evidence of these concerns, then yeah, I think going forward. I know that it's at least been thought of or slightly part of the conversation for how to negotiate drug prices and set value going forward. So we'll see if that's how that comes into the policy discussion.
Thank you. Actually, I have a follow-up question in terms of shaming. And Aaron, maybe you've interacted with physicians, because one thing is we assume it's a conscientious person, but if the original attitude is pride, that you are getting all the support from industry, how would the shaming even take any space in the US culture with these physicians? Or usually they do realize it's not the right thing to do?
I think it's interesting, and I think that there's a large amount of heterogeneity there. So maybe that's already the answer, but I think that it would range all the way from people who maybe like myself, who if when accidentally something gets reported to our name in the open payments database, we take every effort possible to get the mistake scrubbed out of the system because we don't want it there, all the way to other people who wear it as a badge of honor, and see industry would be framed as collaboration, as industry collaboration, as as something positive, and hence not something to be shied away from at all.
Michael, I see your hand, but I just follow up very quickly with Aaron on one question. Aaron, personally, as an oncologist in the US, do you feel that you stand out from your colleagues? Did you ever encounter any questions from them as to why you're so honest and different and looking at all this stuff? Why aren't you like everyone else? Or did it have any impact on the career progression? I mean, considering at which hospital you are, you're very successful, but
Yeah. I don't know that I'm different as an oncologist. I mean, certainly I am a little bit of I'm definitely on one end of the spectrum and probably the tail of one end of the spectrum. But I think that is a spectrum that kind of goes across all medical specialties. And I think within every specialty, there's a general heterogeneity of views, and a lot of people who openly collaborate with industry and are proud of it, and there are people who have concerns about promotion and the potential impact on care. In terms of my own career trajectory, I was warned during an early stage in my career not to pursue this line of research out of its controversial nature, and I didn't listen. And I think I got lucky because I happened to land at institution under kind of another through recruitment by other people who shared my views, notably Dr. Peter Bach, who was here at MSKCC before I was and was very outspoken about drug pricing issues and the impacts of industry practices. And so for me, it actually helped raise my profile as being someone interested and willing to hit the hornet's nest.
But it's actually wonderful to have you as an example for medical students exiting universities and starting their career, that it's possible to make a successful career on the right path. So that's bravo to you. Thank you. So Michael, please go ahead with your question.
Hi. I'm glad I wasn't smart enough to get into medical school. And if you study engineering, your grades typically aren't high enough to get in anyway. So that's the benefit and drawback of the education I did. But like I worked in heavy construction for a long time, and that is truly one of the most corrupt industries in the world. Like, I'm not a saint, so I saw things that I was uneasy with. But there was a like quite a differential standard I see in these health technologies, so the devices and the drugs. And like I'll just tell you, in engineering, there are local regulators that are simply shut down when they see ties of this kind that are tolerated by regulators. So regulators are self-regulating professions, are usually given their power by some higher level of government. And I've seen regulators absolutely shut down in engineering, and the higher power will say, okay, you're a self-regulating profession. You're done for a while. And then they take it over. And a common standard when it comes to conflict of interest, maybe not common, is there a credible appearance of a possible conflict of interest? That's a question you could ask. So when someone is accepting sort of emoluments or inducements, and definitely, there are some here, that is something where there's a credible appearance of a possible conflict of interest. And now your database is indicating, quite a lot more money than, I'm very clean compared to the amounts of money that I see reported. So I guess the question is, what's an appropriate standard? And when it comes to prescribing medications that, after all, have adverse effects, which would make anyone uneasy, what would an appropriate standard be? And I would start with, is there a credible appearance of a possible conflict of interest? And if there is, you shouldn't do it. Like that the practitioner should not be permitted by a regulator to do that. I'd start there. And then anything, more lenient than that. So I just wonder what you think about, like, what's an appropriate standard?
So I also would start there, and then the DHHS Office of Inspector General has also started there. my only concern is they haven't done much more than start. And what I mean by that is that they apply the exact same standard and very similar language as what you're describing, the credible appearance of conflict of interest. And they are very clear in guidance and documentation and regulation that they've published that their definition of meeting that standard is a doctor receives money from a drug manufacturer and then subsequent to the receipt of that money prescribes a drug produced by that manufacturer. They're explicit that you do not need to like apply a causal inference method study like the one I showed to prove that the doctor would not have prescribed that drug if not for the inducement, right? It's the only bar you have to meet is that temporal correlation. So for me, I'm like, that sounds like a great standard. That's enough to answer that part of your question. And that then gets back to like my thoughts about what the next step would be. Like this is the case in almost every single payment that happens in the like this whole like $5 billion worth, right, of payments every year. It's the payment first, and then doctors continue to prescribe payment or medications made by that company. So I think all these payments are already violating that standard. I think that greater enforcement could be therefore applied based on what we already have, like the standard that we already have and the behavior that we already see.
So the big disclosure blocks in every paper I see in the big journals, you know, like when you say you did something wrong, the implication is you'll stop doing it. You know, I can't go to court and say, yeah, I stole a car and I'm given some kind of light sentence, and then I show up again and do it. Like, I mean, what's it going to take? You think it'll be some type of administrative monetary penalty or revocation of license that will cause a shift? Like, I guess we're saying there's no obvious.
I think what I'm saying is that would cause a shift if it were instituted. I'm not saying that I think that is likely or that it's that would be the best way forward. I'm saying I think it would be very possible under existing law, and it would be effective if it happened. I don't know. Maybe I'm still naively hopeful that there will be enough of an opinion change among physicians, and I think there has been some over time, but I think that is still unfortunately, one of the main obstacles to change is that we kind of actively advocate to the contrary or to maintain the status quo. And I think if we were to stop doing that, and then the bulk of us were to then be in agreement with changes needed, then the holdouts who really want to maintain the status quo wouldn't have as much ground to stand on. But unfortunately, I think it's still the minority and majority opinion still are in the wrong direction.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Michael, for your questions. So, David, please go ahead.
I was very interested to hear that engineering is so corrupt. I like many people, I must have been wondering why tower blocks still get inflammable cladding put on them. You may have heard of the Grenfell Tower disaster in London, which was where no one is taking responsibility for what seems like a very rash building procedure. So perhaps somebody got rich from it. And perhaps we'll never know, despite the inquiry that's been going on forever.
Well, in terms of conflicts of interest, perhaps we can host an event inviting the military defense complex here, finance industry, food industry, pharma industry, and now I didn't know construction industry was supposed to be on the list, but let's see who wins the first place and what kind of solutions can work in terms of rotating doors with regulators and influencing decision makers. Very interesting discussion. So thank you so much, Aaron, for sharing your work, for bringing us more light to this particular topic. As I say, we are continuing our discussion on conflict of interest. This is our, I think, third or fourth event on the subject. And in 2 weeks, we have another very interesting talk from an advocate, also focusing on the topic. So look forward to seeing you in the end of April, and wishing you a good evening and good afternoon in the US. All right, bye-bye.